Hello, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if you're calling in from the US. Thank you very much for coming to our webinar, and welcome to you all. For those who haven't been to one of our webinars before, we regularly run best practice webinars here at Curo, just taking out half an hour of your day to hopefully bring you up to date with some sort of key exciting topics that are going on mainly in the area of reward. So earlier this year, we ran a number of sessions on the new proposed legislation for gender pay reporting in the UK, and we scheduled this session as an update because the legislation was due to be released at the end of July, and I will update you on that during this session. I do know we have some people signed up from the US, so I'm not sure if you're attending to learn specifically about the UK legislation, but the issues we'll cover today more towards the back end of our half an hour slot are pertinent for the initiatives that are happening in the US as well, generally around establishing an equal and fair pay policy. So on to our agenda. I'm going to do a quick introduction to myself and Curo. From a housekeeping perspective, you are all on mute, but you can submit questions using the chat button. That's the speech bubble button that you can hopefully see at the top of your screen in the Join Me box. So you can submit those during the presentation. There will be a time at the end when we'll allow 5 minutes at the end. So if you can try and keep them for them, because then I can try and get through the content of the half-hour slot that we have. We are recording this session, and we're happy to share the recording with you and also the slide deck, a PDF of the slide deck. And you can get back in touch with Carol, who has kindly organised this event for us today, if you want to request any of that information. So just a quick introduction then. So I'm Ruth Thomas. I'm a senior consultant and co-founder of the business here at Curo. And at Curo Compensation, we are compensation planning experts who have predominantly worked in comp planning within organisations, within reward functions, and or worked with HR technology. And what we do is we work with leading companies who use our technology, which is a best-of-breed SaaS compensation management solution. We're a small but growing business. We're headquartered in the UK and with offices in Edinburgh and London, and we also now have an office in Dallas. We have a very strong client community who have all worked with us and with each other during client forums, and they are very much involved in helping us to evolve the product of Curo. And here's just an example of some of the clients that we work with, and across many different sectors, as you can see. So we're not sector specific, but mainly we're working with clients who want to improve the whole management of their compensation processes by utilising technology, and they want to improve the value that they provide to their business around that whole area of functionality. So on to today's topic and gender pay reporting. So I'm going to start off focusing purely on the UK gender pay gap reporting requirements. But first of all, start with some quick context. So it's 45 years since the Equal Pay Act of 1970 in the UK, and it is fair to say that we have made some significant progress on equal pay in the UK during that time. We do now have, a record number of women in UK in work, and we have more women on the FTSE 100 boards than we ever had before. And actually, if you look at the historical trend of the gender pay gap, it is at its lowest on record. However, it is still a significant gender pay gap. So the all employees pay gap is 19.2%, which, there's been many headlines, articulating what the impact for women is of that pay gap, and I won't go into those right now. But I guess it is important to note that current predictions are that unless we start to take some action, it will take 47 years for us to narrow that pay gap at the current rates of progress. So looking at that 19.2% gap figure, which I'm showing you on this slide here, so that is for all employees, full-time and part-time, and it's this figure that is predominantly the focus of the GPG reporting regulations. It's important to note that these headline figures are very contentious. Many commentators, myself included, argue that simply looking at the difference between men and women's average salaries really fails to convey the complexity of the gap, the pay gap, and it doesn't take into account the fact that it's not just the gender pay gap we need to consider, but also what other forms of employment disadvantage women are prone to. In the words of the British Chamber of Commerce, it is taking a set of complex issues and reducing it to a few headline statistics. And that's probably one of the key criticisms labelled at this whole initiative. And, if you're honest, nobody really believes that compulsory gender pay reporting will on its own close the gender pay gap. And it could be argued that the introduction of the national living wage this year in April could do more to close the gender pay gap, with women predicted to benefit more from the changes associated with that legislation. As soon as you delve beneath the headline figures, those mean or median average figures, you can start to see some of the interesting observations. If we strip out part-time workers, you can see immediately that the gender pay gap narrows to 9.4% nationally. These are national figures from the Office of National Statistics. And if you take a look at part-time workers, you can see that many more women work part-time, 42.5% of all women in the workforce, compared to 13.2% of males. And the fact that many women are engaged in lower paying occupations, sometimes known as the 5 Cs, caring, cashiering, cleaning, catering, and clerical, this has a significant impact on the median hourly earnings for those part-time employees, and you can see the difference there at the bottom of right of my slide. The last slide from the ONS data that I'm going to share is this one on occupational segregation. Significant variation you can see towards the left-hand side of my slide, those traditional male-dominated sectors such as finance, construction, much higher pay gap there, running towards the other side of the slide, more typically female-dominated professions. And that sector analysis I'll touch on again later, very important when I think for benchmarking. It will become very important for benchmarking for you as you go through this journey of gender pay gap reporting. So on to the regulations. I'm going to quickly cover I'm going to explain the timing and logistics, because I'm going to update you on the latest of where we are on that. If you've been to this GPG webinar before, some of the content will be the same. I'm going to talk about who is covered and what the reporting requirements are. So timing-wise, I've talked about the Equal Pay Act. Many of you will also know then that in 2010 we had the Equality Act, which banned pay secrecy, but that had a section known as Section 78, which allowed for compulsory pay gap reporting and equal pay reporting. And that really was only affected in the public sector with a voluntary approach outside of this. And in order to encourage a voluntary approach outside of the public sector, the government launched its Think, Act, Report initiative in 2011. And that was to encourage companies to improve their gender equality reporting on a voluntary basis. And if you think there's about over 7,000 companies who are going to be impacted by the new legislation, about only 275 employers have actually signed up to that initiative, and under 10 of those have actually published their gender pay gaps. So that's really part of the reasoning behind why we're seeing this legislation that started with the Small Business Enterprise Act of 2015. There was a large consultation last summer in July, which was the first consultation we had that went out for a number of months. And the results of that consultation was published in February this year. And they also at that time published the new draft proposed regulations. And there was an additional consultation of 1 month on those regulations. So since then, we've really been waiting to see what happens next. Now, it was expected that the new regulations, the finalised regulations, would be passed on the 1st of October 2016. And that's why they were due to sort of be released at the end of July, so that we would be able to get ready for that. However, that's not happened, I think, due to Brexit activity. It's now a briefing I attended at the IES a couple of weeks ago, basically indicated that the government was now indicating that that regulation won't be published probably until September. There's not expected to be any significant change to the legislation, but there will be more clarity on a lot of the unanswered questions that have been raised as a result of the draft regulations. So when that regulation will be passed, well, normally employment legislation's only ever passed effective either the 1st of April or the 1st of October. But we don't believe that they'll make the 1st of October date, but we also don't believe they'll hold it to the 1st of April. So they may make an exception and pass that legislation by the end of the year. The effective reporting dates then, we've been told, won't change. So the first relevant date of the 30th of April 2017 is still going to be the first cut of data required to report on. And I guess the only other update I can give you is apparently now ACAS are drafting their guidelines for interpreting the regulations, and that's due in January next year, January 2017. So it's likely that it's not until then we'll get the finer detail answering a lot of the questions that I know many of us have on the regulations. So hopefully that's given you as much as I know based on the briefings that I've attended and the experts that I've spoken to in terms of where we are on the publication of the legislation. So a quick run through of the regulations, because hopefully most of you are up to speed with this, and those of you who attended my webinars, this is what I've covered before. But the regime, the reporting regime will apply to British employers in the private and voluntary sectors with at least 250 UK-based employees. They include a definition of what a relevant employee is. And the interesting point is that reporting is meant to be done on a legal entity basis, so you don't need to aggregate it on a company basis. There are all sorts of issues associated with reporting on a legal entity basis. Many large corporates will have to report by each legal entity, and they don't really think of themselves in that way, which it will be somewhat an onerous reporting exercise for them. What you're going to have to publish, there's three main groups of data. The first, salary-based pay gap figures, the percentage difference in mean hourly pay during the relevant pay period, and the same for median hourly pay. So that relevant pay period, that's going to be whatever the employee's pay period is that covers the 30th of April 2017. So they may be weekly paid and the 30th of April falls in that period, or they may be monthly paid. And you're going to take the snapshot of data for that specific period as to what someone is being paid. And I'll come on to talk about some of the issues associated with that. On salary also, you're going to be asked to report the distribution of the number of male and female employees by quartile salary bands. There's been some debate as to how you will strike those salary quartile bands, but the briefing session I attended recently reiterated that will be based on the overall pay range rather than by the number of employees. And the reason for that reporting is really to try and help address some of the issues that might be hidden in single average figures, and also in response to concerns from the first consultation that if you were to report by job grades or titles publicly, one, that could have data protection issues in smaller companies where you've only got a certain number of people employed at a certain job grade. But also for many of these organisations, we're talking about 250 plus organisations, many companies don't have job grades or job titles, and it would be too complex for them to put that in time to meet the timing of the proposed regulations. The final area that you're going to have to report on is the mean bonus gap, and also the proportion of men and women receiving a bonus. And that is, the relevant period for that is 12 months running up to the 30th of April. So you will look at people on payroll at the 30th of April. So no, you won't have to include leavers, and it will cover what payments people have had in the 12 months prior to the 30th of April. So for many of you, that will be bonuses that have already been paid. So that's why I'll come on to talk about later. It's really important that you start thinking about this now. There's a link at the bottom of this slide, which will take you, if you use that hyperlink, it will take you through to the gender pay gap reporting draft regulations if you haven't had a read of those, if you want the detail. The next slide I'm quickly going to share with you is an ONS slide as well. It's from the Office of National Statistics, but it's their data, national data, that gives you an example of what your quartile pay analysis might look like. So you can see it's showing you the proportion of men and women in each quartile reported in a nice graphical format there, and that's something that you're probably wanting to achieve yourselves. So in terms of pay, what is meant by pay? Well, it's the gross hourly rate of pay, as I said, that falls on April the 30th. And it is before PAYE, NI, pension schemes, student loan repayments, and other voluntary deductions are made. The draft legislation gives you the list here of what pay does include and doesn't include. So I'm not going to list all of those. I guess a number of concerns there. Bonus pay I've got highlighted. What my concern around that is double counting. Are we doing bonus pay here and then bonus under the bonus reporting? There's a lot of unanswered questions around things like car allowance, for example. You'll have some organisations where people have the option of taking a car or a car allowance, and those that take a car allowance are obviously going to inflate their pay. If you're taking their actual payroll data, which the regulations seem to be indicating you should, then you are going to have people on maternity pay or other types of leave, like sabbaticals or family leave, and that's obviously going to skew your figures, particularly as the maternity pay people are obviously going to be women. Salary sacrifice is another one I've got a question over. I think that would mean that that's the pre-deductions, but excludes the flex allowance. So you take their whole salary, don't make any deductions that they've elected from salary sacrifice. But, I think the main issue to point out here is that you've probably got many questions. I've still got many questions. And we're hoping that when the final regulations and the ACAS guidelines come out, they will clear up all those outstanding issues for us. The same applies to bonus. So there's the definition of what bonus includes. So basically all forms of variable or incentive pay. But again, a lot of question around the treatment of deferred awards and options. How should we value those? What's the impact of any malice or clawback provisions that we might have operating? And I guess another question for me is, if you're only reporting bonus payments paid, you're not taking into account bonus eligibility and maybe the reason why someone did or didn't get awarded a bonus. And in fact, the impact of performance-related pay. Someone may get a bigger bonus because they performed better, and that's not a real discriminatory reason. So lots of questions around that. But I guess the feeling was that we wanted to include reporting bonuses because it is such a large proportion of pay for significant number of companies. So after the first consultation, that the reporting of bonuses was included. So once you've done your analysis, where are you going to have to, your mandatory analysis, where are you going to have to report it? So the regulations state that you're going to have to include that on your website in the UK in English. That needs to be accessible to all employees and the public. And note that it's got to be there for a period of 3 years from publication date. So you need to think about what that's going to look like year over year. And it needs to be accompanied by a written statement that confirms that the information is accurate by an appropriate person in your business or legal entity. It will also need to be uploaded to a government-hosted website. We don't know where that's going to be yet. And that website will potentially have league tables. Again, hopefully you've read in the press, lots of concern about those league tables. There's been some speculation that will be the HMRC website that we'll be uploading this to, but not confirmed at this stage. And I think the final point to make there is, there are no civil or criminal penalties if you don't comply with this legislation. The final point on the legislation that I'm going to cover is around the subject of contextual information. So there is no mandate to publish a narrative or an action plan, but it is encouraged, it says in the regulations. And, I think you really need to tell your own story before someone else does. The press are unlikely to be focused on the detail, and more the headline figures and the league tables. So I think, you still need to consider all the risks, though, associated with publishing a narrative. So you need to think about whatever you're saying, whether that could be used in an equal pay claim against you. So there is a concern around, we might see a rise in the number of equal pay claims. You need to think about your reputational risk. You can ask yourself, is it worse to publish the data or not publish it, from a risk perspective? And that's maybe a question that you'd pose to your senior executives. And really, in publishing this information, you need to think about employee engagement, as we need to think about it at all times, and whether, the impact that might have both on employees you're trying to attract to the organisation, as well as the employees currently working in your organisation. So that was a quick run through of the regulations. If that was too quick for you, I'm sorry. If you want to know more information or you have any questions, do get in touch. Happy to have a conversation with anybody, but I am aware that I have covered that before. I'm going to now take you through sort of our recommendations of how to prepare yourself for gender pay gap reporting if you haven't started already. But I'm going to start with equal pay. First of all, I mentioned that about equal pay claims. It's worth reiterating the difference between what equal pay is and gender pay. So you may have one without the other. You may have both. So they're not mutually exclusive. So we know equal pay is all about, it being illegal, to have equal pay for work of equal value. And it's very much based on a person-by-person assessment. Whereas the gender pay gap is obviously looking across collective groups of employees, because we're looking at these average figures. And, as I said earlier, it's not unlawful to have a gender pay gap, fortunately, because we know most of us are going to have gender pay gaps. So here's a simple 5-point plan that we'd recommend. You need to gather the data and do your analysis. You need to establish the causes of any significant pay gaps and assess the justifications for them. You need to have a think about, as an organisation, what's your objective and vision, come up with what your action plan is, and then I'll come on to say, about the importance of really acting now and planning ahead. So for that first stage, gathering data, it's worth thinking about this if you haven't done it already, do start now. This may be a challenge because going back to those definitions of pay, the gender pay gap data includes a lot of payroll type information, and this may need to come, for you from multiple sources. You might not just be able to rely on your HR system. So you need to think about, first of all, where are you going to get all of that information? Then it's doing the analysis. So obviously do the mandatory analysis, but you obviously need to take that to the next level to even start to do that justification. And so the top part of my slide there really sort of gives you some suggestions of how you would drill down. So obviously you're going to start to look at those average figures by grade, business group, by location, and by any other relevant demographic that is important to your organisation. You're going to need to look at the impact of female representation across your whole workforce and consider your full-time to part-time pay gaps. And other things you might want to take into consideration around things like average length of service, the impact on starting salaries, the impact of promotees, and industry benchmarking. I mentioned that earlier. The CBI initial response to the consultation from February and the concern over league tables was stating that gender pay gap figures need to be put into context and that businesses should be able to explain these figures. And the government should show industry averages so firms can benchmark themselves against that. And that's really going to be important for you, I think, as you begin this journey on gender pay gap reporting. A lot of what we do here at Curo is really focusing on supporting our clients through their annual compensation review process or through their mid-year compensation review processes. And I would also encourage you to think about your equal pay, gender pay reporting that's associated with that process. And this slide has some examples of the types of reporting that you might want to consider. So my recommendation is, if you haven't done it, that you should do this level of reporting on the last review output and use this as a baseline for the forthcoming reviews, because undoubtedly the next review that you have is most likely to fall in what's deemed the relevant pay period. And I definitely would consider sharing this with managers ahead of the review. and making sure that they can see the impact of their decisions during the next pay review as they're making those critical compensation decisions. And obviously a technology solution like Curo can help you with that. So it's giving, easily understandable analytics to managers, at the beginning of the review, and then as they progress through the review, so they can see, the impact of their decisions and what the old salary was and what the new salary was and what that's having from a GPG perspective. So an example of that I'm just showing you on the screen now. The next slide I'm going to consider is some of the pay gap causes. So what things should you consider doing? So some of these you can see starting at the beginning of the slide are very reward-focused issues. And that will be things like looking at the eligibility rules as they apply to all of your reward elements and making sure there's no discriminatory aspects associated with them. And in fact, doing that across all the types of pay that you award people, and looking at the policies and processes, and to see if there's, any areas of concern. You can also, do a historical analysis. You can look at promotion practices, and, wherever you have discretion in your compensation schemes, I'd definitely, have a look at the potential biases that might, unintentional biases or otherwise, that might be creeping in there. But as I said, you need to take that a bit broader beyond reward, and start looking at some other areas of sort of the general HR and employee management spectrum. So looking at performance criteria, understanding gender profiles by role, looking at job design, and understanding things about where and when women opt out of your workforce. And very much, I think the point to make here is that it is not a reward issue. So if this is being thrown at you over the fence, you can't do this on your own. Yes, you will ultimately probably be responsible for doing the analytics, but solving this issue is definitely not a reward issue alone. And it is very much a diversity and inclusion issue. And you're going to need to work with your colleagues across all the different areas of HR to make sure that addressing the gender pay gap issues works, all together. So the third step in our 5-step plan is establishing an objective and a vision. So once you've done that analysis and you can understand what the characteristics of your workforce are from a gender perspective, then you need to decide what do you want to change. Look at that industry benchmarking and work out what it is that you want to change in your organisation. And then really you very much need to get senior level buy-in. Again, this is not just a reward issue, it's not an HR issue, it is very much a reputational risk issue, and you need to get senior level buy-in, most importantly for your action plan. And we, as well as writing your narrative to be published to the website, we recommend creating an action plan. I've got a little example of one. If you want to, obviously this has been going on for some time in the public sector, and if you Google equal pay action plan, you can find lots of examples from the public sector that are in the public domain of equal pay or gender pay action plans. I'll give you some good examples. I think I just extracted one there. But create your action plan, get senior level buy-in. Again, consider sharing this with your employees and the public. But if you do that, you need to very much make sure it's attainable and that you have the resources committed to achieving this. And finally, I'm just going to finish on the case for gender pay gap reporting and in fact the case for equal pay, and why it is important. I've highlighted a few areas here. We know we're working in the environment of a war for talent, and if we can address equal pay and equal gender employment, then we are able to fish in a much bigger pool. Some other interesting points to consider are around things like customer orientation. So, you can note the fact that women make 80% of consumer purchases in the UK. We know that women are much better shoppers than men. So if you're that type of company that is focused on your consumers, then you really want to have that diversity in your workforce to mirror your consumers. And also research has shown that diverse groups often outperform experts. So you want a diverse group of decision makers. Also, generally thinking about your company image and social responsibility. and your whole employee value proposition. And there are a number of studies. There's a number of links to all of those in this slide, if you ask for the deck, that also provide the financial argument. So if you're having to justify this to anybody in your organisation, you can access some of this research here. But I guess, you know, one of the public headlines that we've seen is the belief that the UK could add 0.6 trillion to its GDP by 2025 by fully bridging the gender gap. And you know, that's a lot of work been done by McKinsey on this topic, and their paper on why diversity matters, you know, also emphasises that gender diverse companies are 15% more likely to outperform their peers. So lots of research, and I've included some of that there for you to go and have a look at afterwards, about, you know, from a financial impact on a company and its bottom line, why you want to consider doing this. So just as a recap, what was our 5-point plan? We talked about gathering data and doing the in-depth analysis, looking at the reasons for your pay gaps and the justifications, creating your narrative, understanding what your objective and vision is, and coming up with an action plan. And that final point is act now and plan ahead. I mean, speaking to people, it's sort of 50-50 as to who has done something and who hasn't. Many companies, well, very few companies have actually published anything. A lot of people have done a first cut of the analysis, maybe not including all the data points that are included in the regulations, but have, you know, made a stab at looking at their gender pay gap and the impact of that. They also know that, you know, during the last pay review, some of our clients and other people I've spoken to did allocate budget to address equal pay, gender pay gap issues. And if you didn't do that, you probably do need to think about doing that as you come into your budget modelling and budget planning phase this autumn for your next compensation reviews. It's important, really, I think, to get a baseline of data, even though we don't know the finer details of the regulation. You know, get that baseline of data to understand the quantum of the problem that you may or may not have in your organisation. I think the only final point I'd make there is the contentiousness of the GPG figures. When you do start undertaking your action plan, you will probably find that gender pay gap will actually get worse before it gets better. And this was a topic discussed at our Comp and Coffee session in May. If any of you came to that event, we had one of our clients speaking, sharing his views around that. So, you know, a professional services firm where they've taken many initiatives to increase the number of women they're recruiting at the lower end of their career ladder. And as a result, their gender pay gap has got worse as a result of taking positive action. So that's something you should consider as well. That's going to be difficult to see how that plays out in the press. I think, you know, there's a lot of sort of education and understanding that needs to happen around that, but it's just to raise that issue for you. And finally, the gender pay gap really, and addressing the issues associated with that, is really just part of overall a fair reward checklist that, you know, we would encourage you to do in your organisations. So if you can answer yes to all of these questions, then you're in a pretty good position, and you're probably in a good position to address that GPG challenge. If you have to answer no to some of these, then you probably need to start addressing some of these areas, because the whole aspect around, you know, having clearly defined roles, to make comparisons, to be able to communicate and have pay transparency, and to understand, you know, around training your managers around the whole area of equal pay and gender pay gap, and understanding the concept of unconscious bias. You know, these are some of the clear activities that you may want to put in your to-do list or your action plan over the next 12 months. So I think we're just over time, but I'm happy to sit here for a few more minutes if you want to submit any questions. I'll pick them up from the chat box at the top. Equally, you know, you can submit, if you don't want to ask in front of everybody else, absolutely email in, and I promise you I do reply to them all. Carol makes sure I reply to all of the questions that come in, so you can feel free to ask any questions over the email as well. So any questions from anyone? Oh, okay, great. Well, as I said, email in any questions. I promise you I'll get back to you on those. And thanks very much for coming to attend today's webinar. As I said, you can request a copy of the presentation, and you can also get access to a recording. Oh, sorry, I've just seen a question come in. Hang on. Do we know if there is a confirmed template for our submission, or if each company can report in a way that suits them? There is no confirmed template at this stage. Definitely, we know that. So if you read the regulations, it is very light in terms of the information. Again, that may come in the regulations, unlikely. I think that's probably something more that will be contained in the ACAS guidelines that, as I said, I think are due. We're anticipating that those will be due by January 2017. So, ACAS will hopefully give us, as practitioners, as much as the guideline needed to hopefully meet these regulations. Any more questions I can help you with today? Great. Okay, we're conscious of your time, so I'm going to finish this webinar now. As I said, if you want a copy of the PowerPoint or you wish to request a copy of the webinar, please get in touch with Carol. Her details, she would have emailed you, but her details are here. And we look forward to seeing you on one of our webinars in the future. Thanks very much.